Welcome to our 16th CRWDP webinar. How the presentation is going to run today is that I will briefly introduce our speaker. She will present, and then we'll follow that with a Q&A. Tammy Bernasky, our presenter, is a PhD candidate in critical disability studies at York University. She's also the interim provincial coordinator for the Ontario cluster of CRWDP. Tammy has been working on disability rights at the local, national, and international levels for more than 15 years. She has worked on disability projects in the areas of human rights, employment, accessibility, community-based rehabilitation, and gender-based violence. So today, Tammy is going to present on her PhD work, which involved interviewing community advocates and organizers who work to resist gender-based violence in the disability community. Approaching this work from an anti-oppressive and intersectional perspective, Tammy will focus her presentation on intersectional oppressions and analysis. She will share her experience in working through these issues from a researcher's perspective. So that is our introduction, and I'll hand it over to you, Tammy.
Thank you, Dan. And I want to thank you for the opportunity to talk about my work. As Dan said, I'm going to talk about gender-based violence and disability oppression, and I'm going to try to offer an intersectional analysis. So I guess I don't really need to say much more about myself. I'm a PhD candidate. I'm hoping to finish my PhD in the coming month or so. And my areas of interest right now are gender-based violence, socioeconomic oppression, and intersectionality. So for today, I'm going to give you a brief overview of my dissertation, and then I'll discuss some important concepts within my work, and I'll offer some highlights from my participants. I haven't defended my dissertation yet. Hopefully that will be soon. So today I'm just going to focus on some of the participants' experiences in order to highlight intersectionality. So I won't be focusing so much on my theories around consciousness and empowerment, but rather on experiences that highlight intersectionality. I want to first start by talking about my committee members for my dissertation. I'll start by saying that I have loved every minute of the process of doing a PhD, and that is in large part due to my committee. I like to call them my dream team. So my supervisor is Dr. Rachel De Silveira Gorman. She's in critical disability studies at York. Dr. Marcia Ryu, also in critical disability studies, and Dr. Annie Bunting, who teaches in law and society at York as well. Each of these committee members have brought different things to my dissertation, and they've really helped me shape my ideas and helped me move forward in my work. So I couldn't have done this without them. And I wanted to take a moment to acknowledge that. So as Dan said, I'll just give an overview of my project here. I interviewed community-based advocates and organizers about gender-based violence in the disability community. I wanted to know about the motivations and challenges to doing this work, and I wanted to look at the impact of community organizing. And I'll talk a little bit about why that is in just a moment. In terms of methods, I interviewed participants globally. I did my first interview in India, in Hyderabad. My second interview was in Nepal. And then the rest of the interviews I either did in person in Toronto, I did one by email, and then the rest were virtually. And again, I asked questions around motivations, hopes, and challenges. So once I interviewed my participants, I transcribed all of the interviews and I did a content analysis to look at themes. And so basically content analysis was just looking for some of the common ideas that came out in the stories. What I discovered though was that in doing this, I couldn't separate parts of their experiences and feel like I was doing justice to the stories that I was being told. And within disability studies, I really think that storytelling is important. So I decided to tell all of the stories of my participants. And in order to do this, I actually introduced each of my themes in my dissertation with a story from a participant. I had 13 participants from Australia, Bangladesh, Canada, Ghana, India, Kenya, the US, Nepal, and Yemen. So I thought I would start with a little bit about why I'm doing this work. The research has already told us that women with disabilities are more likely to live in poverty and on less total income than women without disabilities and men. They're less likely to be employed, less likely to get married, more likely to get divorced, and are more likely to experience physical, sexual, emotional, and psychological abuse. There are other forms of violence I'm going to talk about as well, but this was some of the background research that really started me off in the direction that I took with my dissertation. So then I decided to look at gender-based violence and disability. And I chose to look specifically at gender-based violence because gender-based violence, as the slides say, is violence that's committed against someone because of their gender identity. And it's violence that's rooted in power imbalances and gender inequality. There's also disability-based violence, so that's violence that happens based on disability. And basically these kinds of violences intersect with each other. So if we look at the specific forms of abuse and violence that women with disabilities can face, there's the withholding of care or medication, there's isolation, financial abuse, there's issues around reproductive rights, who has the right to parent, sterilization, forced institutionalization, and psychiatric interventions. And some of these issues came up within my dissertation as well, which I'll get to in just a moment. Importantly, though, there are other aspects of identity that affect our experience. Today, I'm going to focus a lot on gender and disability specifically, but there are other aspects that are important, such as race, class, citizenship status, for example. I'll give one example here in Canada. So disability support services, health services, employment and income support are usually provincially regulated and funded. But Indigenous issues in Canada are federally regulated, so often there'll be a complex landscape, a policy landscape for Indigenous women with disabilities trying to access services. And I'll give you one example of the intersection between indigeneity and disability that always comes to mind when I talk about this, and that's Jordan's principle. And Jordan was a young Indigenous boy with complex medical needs, and he had disabilities. And he spent a lot of time in the hospital. And eventually he was able to go home with supports in place. Unfortunately, though, because the governments were arguing over who was going to pay for his care, Jordan spent all of his life in the hospital, and eventually that's where he died. So Jordan's principle is the idea that if there are issues or concerns or supports that are needed for a child with a disability, because Jordan wasn't the only Indigenous child in this situation, they would get that support, it would be given to them at home, and then the governments can work out among themselves how to deal with these issues. So that's just one example I wanted to give today. Oppression is a big part of my dissertation, so I relied on, or drew heavily upon, Iris Marion Young's 5 Faces of Oppression. And I chose these because they really do speak to the kinds of, the ways that oppression can manifest itself. And she talked a lot about oppression in terms of labor, but that can be extended to other areas of life. The first one is exploitation. So that's the transfer of energy or resources from one group of people to another without fair compensation. The second one is marginalization, which is basically the pushing of a group of people to the margins of society or to the lower social status. Powerlessness is the third form, and some have argued that this is the strongest form of oppression. And it's the idea that there's a domination of a group of people who have to take orders from others without any autonomy or decision-making powers. The fourth kind is cultural imperialism. So that's the idea that the ideas of the ruling class, to use a Marxist term, are the ruling ideas. And so whatever the norm is, people have to fit into that norm. And if you don't, you're othered. The final form of oppression is violence. And this can take many forms. It can be physical, structural, emotional. There are all kinds of violences. What's important, though, when you think about violence in terms of oppression, is that it's unpredictable. And so people who are always at risk of violence are always fearful of random attacks. And that's what makes this important in terms of oppression. So women with disabilities can experience physical, sexual, emotional exploitation. They're at risk of having resources withheld or being denied access to services. There's forced institutionalization, forced sterilization, and people with disabilities are often marked by stereotypes of normalcy. So women with disabilities are at constant risk of not fitting into the norm and experiencing violence. So then there's disability oppression. And James Charlton wrote a book called Nothing About Us Without Us in 1998. The book is fascinating. He talks about oppression, and then he talks about consciousness. He talks about false consciousness, raised consciousness, and empowerment. So basically, he talks about moving from being oppressed to being empowered. For today, though, I'm only going to talk about 3 contributing factors that he mentions that contribute to disability oppression. The first one is political economy. So this is the idea, well, there's always been a link between poverty and disability. People with disabilities are often excluded from economic activities. Their participation is lower. There's less accessibility to the labor market, financial services, capital, microfinance institutions, and this is hindered by a lack of physical access to spaces. There's also communication accommodations that aren't often met. There's attitudinal barriers around misconceptions that people with disabilities can't contribute to the labor market. The second form, or the second contributing factor, is negative attitudes about disability. And there are all kinds of ways we could talk about this. But for today, I'm going to talk about the media. So the media often will represent disability in very specific ways for very specific purposes. Usually, it's disability as monstrous or threatening, heroic, inspirational, or pitiful. So negative attitudes around gender and disability might come in the form of attitudes about sexuality, reproductive lives. Often women with disabilities are infantilized and thought of as incapable of being sexual beings or effective mothers. A lot of times people will have children taken away and sexual abuse can happen because of a perceived vulnerability. So the third form, or the third contributing factor, is false consciousness. And this basically just means that if you're told something, if you're told that you're not good enough for long enough, you start to believe it. So you accept things the way they are and you don't see your experience as connected to other people. Okay, so I'm going to talk about intersectionality. This was a term that was coined by Kimberly Crenshaw in around 1985. She was looking at race and gender discrimination and how they intersected. She talks about discrimination as traffic, like traffic at an intersection. It may flow from many directions and that increases the risk of harm. But that intersection is where discrimination can take place. So why is intersectionality important? It's important because it helps us understand oppression. I talk about intersectionality because I want to talk about intersectional oppression. The thing is, we have many aspects to our identities, and some of those aspects can change over time, but they can't be separated. And that's really important, but it's also important to recognize that privilege and oppression can happen at the same time. So on the slides, I say privilege and oppression are complex. We can experience both at the same time. And I'll use myself as an example. I'm a white, educated woman with a physical disability. So that means that I have privilege because I'm white, I have privilege because I have an education, but I also experience oppression because I'm a woman, because I have a disability, and I can experience all of those things at the same time. So intersectionality really helps us recognize that there are systems, structures, and norms that create multiple disadvantage and discrimination at the same time. Okay. So I decided to look at social movements. And the reason I did this is because historically, the disability movement and feminist movements have excluded the specific concerns of women with disabilities. that the movements had trouble recognizing that they had to talk to each other about issues. And this came up in my research for sure. A lot of participants talked about how their experiences weren't represented in various movements. So Janet Price talks about what is needed for women with disabilities or the disability movement to include gender, what's needed for that movement to move forward. So the first thing she says is that disability and gender have to be recognized as political issues. The second idea is that they must be accessible in terms of communication in space. So movements must be able to accommodate various communication needs and accessibility around spaces. People must be able to also connect with each other and be able to discuss things with each other, and they must be able to address their exclusion from other movements. Okay. So I said that I interviewed 13 participants. I'm going to highlight some of their experiences now, and then we'll talk about some of the challenges in their work and then some of the transformations that they experienced. And I'm hoping that by doing this, it'll help with understanding the importance of intersectionality. Okay, so like I said, some of the participants talked about a lack of representation in movements. A number of participants said that they would go to meetings around violence and not have disability represented, or they didn't see their experience of gender represented in various movements. A number of participants talked about negative perceptions of their disability and also negative perceptions around them as women with disabilities, for example. So some participants talked about how the people in the community just assumed that they couldn't get married because they were women with disabilities. Other people talked about excessive barriers trying to access education, being asked about how they're going to manage their care needs if they're going to go into the workforce. So they experienced harassment trying to enter the workforce. And then there was abuse at universities as well, and then also forced institutionalization. So one participant talked about disclosing abuse and then being forcibly institutionalized because of that. So these are just some of the experiences that participants across the board had, or across the globe, I should say, had experienced. So I also wanted to know, like, what challenges did they face in their work? So when they're doing the work, there was a whole process about moving from having the experience to doing the work, but we're going to talk about the challenges. The first was around government understanding of intersectionality and then policy commitment to dealing with gender-based violence. So I'll give a couple of examples here. One participant talked about how the government in her location was providing resources. So they had a policy commitment, but the resources were going to providing security within the institution instead of providing effective treatment or support. And this goes sort of to the idea of negative attitudes, because some of the rationale for providing extra support was the idea that, well, people must be dangerous if they're being institutionalized. Another example was around cutting of library services or eliminating tokens for the transit system here in Toronto. And this will affect a number of people because libraries are often used as safe havens for people who might be experiencing abuse, or perhaps women with disabilities are going to access services, but because they have lower income, those service providers will often give tokens to people so that they can use them on the transit system. So what happens when the transit system says we're not going to use those tokens anymore? So these are just some of the complexities around government understanding and policy commitment. The other two challenges that were raised were around a lack of awareness and control of rights. So families talked about not knowing what right their children had to go to school, or rights around reporting abuse, for example, or access to justice. And I'll give one example from Ghana. A participant told me about a young girl who had gone to see her because she was a blind girl, and she had requested that a man help her find her way to the bus. Instead, that man lured her to his room and sexually assaulted her. And so she went to the police, and the police said, well, go back to your community and identify the man, and then come back and tell us who he is. But she couldn't do that because she wouldn't be able to visually identify him. So that's just one example of access to justice. So structural violence was a strong theme within the things that the participants told me. So I'm going to spend a couple of minutes talking specifically about structural violence. So a participant in Australia told me about the abuse of a young girl in a respite center. So what had happened was the parents of the girl was 16 and she had an intellectual disability, and the parents would often send her to a respite center. But they went to see the participant that I was interviewing because they were concerned that their daughter was going to become pregnant because she was likely being abused in the center. So they wanted to have her sterilized. So their solution was to sterilize the daughter rather than they didn't feel like they could address the fact that the respite center was hiring people who would be abusing a young girl in that way. A second example would be relying on service providers after complaints have been filed. So this was an example from Canada where the participant told me that there was a situation where an accessible transit driver had a complaint filed against him, and he was still able, the next day he had to go and pick up the person who had filed the complaint against him. There were other examples of people being kept at home and away from their communities. And then there was this interesting situation, well, actually difficult situation around systemic barriers combined with negative perceptions. So a participant in India told me a story about a cyclone. There was a weather event in India and it caused a lot of flooding, and so some people had died. And the government came out with a policy that said, if you had a family member that died during this incident, then we'll compensate you for the family member. So there was this young girl who she was blind, and she was living with her brother and sister-in-law, and she overheard them plotting to kill her, saying that she didn't contribute to the family, so if they could kill her, they would get the money from the government. So this is actually really interesting because it turned into a situation of community organizing. The young girl was able to get to a local shop, and the shopkeeper called a teacher who then called the participant that I was interviewing. And then they organized, they went into the community in the middle of the night, they were able to get her out. And this young girl actually went on to live with the participant that I was interviewing and still lives with her today. So that's just a way in which system policies and negative perceptions of disabilities can interact to cause violence. Okay, I'll move on. I'm going to talk about motivations now. So I wanted to know, in light of all of the experiences and the challenges that people face, what motivates people to do this work? What keeps them going? So a number of participants talked about doing this work and starting organizations, actually, because they didn't feel represented in the movements. One participant told me that she started an organization specifically for women with disabilities, and the men in the community said, well, you can't run an organization because you've never done it. And she was like, well, actually I can, I've just never been given the opportunity. And now she runs an organization in her country for women with disabilities. Other motivations were around raising awareness about gender-based violence in the disability community. And then also, because of all of these situations and many of the participants experiencing the types of violence that they were working against, many people said that they just wanted better for others. That was a strong motivation. In terms of transformations, or what I would term empowerment, a number of things came out here. Participants talked about seeing themselves represented in the movement and feeling a sense of belonging, because there's a lot of folks in the disability community, we don't grow up with people like us. So for example, I have a physical disability, but I didn't grow up with a group of people who also had a disability. So I didn't have a frame of reference. I don't have anybody to learn how to navigate the world with in terms of identifying with my own experience. So there's a lot of people in the disability community who don't grow up with that. So In organizing, though, participants talked about seeing themselves represented. They talked about community organizing. They talk about having networks of support, so they can see they know how to advocate for their rights now, and they can help other people do the same. Again, if I go back to India, there was around community organizing. There was this teacher, she would go into communities and she would talk to community members about sending their girls to school if they had, they were usually blind girls because it was a school for blind children. And she would organize with community members to help send these young girls to school. Okay, so what does all of this mean? I have a few things to say here, so this will be my last slide, but bear with me for a moment. Overall, the participants talked about building community through resisting oppression. So they felt a sense of purpose. If we go back and look at the false consciousness that I talked about, I would say now that they have an empowered consciousness. They feel more empowered to do the work that they're doing through resisting oppression. Participants had a range of experiences. They had a range of disabilities, social and geographical locations, contexts, gender identities. What I would say, though, and what's really important to me, is that the participants' experience, the experiences that they shared with me at least, demonstrate the importance of addressing intersectionality. And so what I learned in this process as a researcher who is a woman with a disability who has experienced violence and other forms of oppression that I research, this process has been transformative for me because I recognize my experience and the experiences of others, but it's a little bit more complicated than that because I also recognize that people have different gender experiences, people have different kinds of disabilities, they experience disability in different ways, they have different access to resources, and so I always have to be careful not to apply my experience to whatever it is I'm trying to learn about. But I also can't say that I'm completely objective in this because I'm not. But I would say, though, that going through this process has been transformative. And like my participants, I do feel a sense of community in being able to talk to other people who have experiences with gender-based violence and disability. So to conclude, in case any of my participants are watching, I really do think it's important to thank the participants for sharing their experiences and for sharing their stories, for agreeing to share their stories in my dissertation, and for talking about their experiences. So that's it. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you very much, Tammy. That was a really great presentation. And thank you for sharing your own experiences too, as well to your participants for sharing theirs, and then for you sharing those to us. At this point, we can go to the Q&A. So Tammy, I'll just ask you some of the questions that people have put through the Q&A section. The first is from Margaret Oldfield. She said, "Thank you for your revealing presentation, Tammy. Did you look at the intersection between disability and old age? I'm wondering if you interviewed any elderly women with cognitive or physical impairments who have been institutionalized in nursing homes, or people who advocate for them. If not, do you have any thoughts on this form of institutionalization?"
Hi, Margaret. That's an excellent question. So my sample size was small. There were 13 participants, and I guess I didn't say this, but I reached out through various avenues. And unfortunately, no, I wasn't able to interview older participants or participants with intellectual disabilities. And that might have been part of my recruitment, perhaps, because most of my recruitment was through social media, existing networks, email, that sort of thing. So no, I wasn't able to capture the experiences around. Most of the people who talked about institutionalization were talking about psychiatric interventions, but I wasn't able to talk to folks who were institutionalized with the intersection of disability and age as well. But it's certainly an important aspect of identity that I mentioned in my dissertation, but I wasn't able to specifically talk about those experiences. But that's a good point, though, for future research, because this is just the beginning. of what I want to do. So I'll definitely keep that in mind as I move forward with my work. Thank you for that.
Thank you. Our next one comes from Margaret as well. She wrote, glad to see the CART transcription. How did you insert the closed captioning into your slide presentation?
Oh, I didn't actually, that's not me. That's actually, Microsoft can do that. Dan pointed that out to me, so the credit goes to him, not me. But there's just a little function in the new version of PowerPoint where you can show subtitles. Yeah, it's great, isn't it? But I think it works pretty well too.
Yeah, it's pretty fantastic, except for names, I guess.
Yes, well, most of the names were incorrect, but that's okay.
Our next question comes from Dhruba Nupain, who asked, what was the age group of people you interviewed in Nepal?
Oh, hi, Dhruba. I only interviewed one participant from Nepal. I'm not sure what her age was. I would guess, let me say 30 to 45, maybe. I'll make a wide range there. So, yeah, but I only interviewed the one person. Yeah.
Thanks. And just in case for anyone, if you do have follow-up questions, I will continue to monitor the Q&A, so I can always ask a follow-up question now, or otherwise, Tammy just switched to a thank you slide, so she also has her email up there.
Yes,
so you've got multiple options.
Yeah, feel free to email me. Also, I'm about to defend my dissertation, so having questions is good in this format because I will be defending my dissertation on Zoom, which I'm excited but nervous about. So this will be good for thinking about some of the things I should address in my defense as well.
And it looks like Dhruba answered our call and said, okay, how did you select or pick this person?
So networking, I guess you could say. I was working on a project where I went to India, Bangladesh, and Nepal with one of my committee members. And another committee member, the two committee members had suggested a group of people that I should meet while I was traveling to these three countries. And so the participant was somebody who was known to my networks. And I had to meet with them anyway, and they were interested in my study. Some of the other participants, it was not intentional. The participant in India, for example, she was sitting next to me in a van and she said, could you please interview me? And somebody else in the van said, she has quite a story. And I had no idea that she even did work in this field. And yeah, so some of it was rather organic and other times it was people that I was connected to through my networks.
Thank you. Our next question comes from Brianne Peters. She wrote, I'd like to hear more about the process of how they built community and how they organized to resist oppression. How did they bring others into their struggle?
That's a good question, Brianne. Thank you. So a couple of people are coming to mind in thinking about that question around community organizing. A lot of participants talked about how they were experiencing difficult situations, and a couple of them talked about having support from their family members, which was really, I didn't talk about that in this presentation, but having support from family and having access to education was really important to them, and they were able to have that support from their family. But they were also experiencing difficult situations outside of the home and also trying to get into education as well. And so a couple of participants talked about having these experiences, but then they weren't being addressed in the disability community, for example. So they started to talk to other women with disabilities. And it literally just started with conversations among them. And then they started to realize that there were more people that were having the same experiences. And so those people would reach out to other people, and that's how some of the organizations started. It started with two people having a conversation and then reaching out to two more people, and so on and so forth. And so then they had to think about, like, how are we going to get resources? And so they just worked with the skills and the strengths that the people in the communities already had. But primarily it was recognizing that they had shared experiences and then moving on from there. Was there another part to that question? Resisting oppression. Yeah, so how would I answer that? There are so many ways that they talked about resisting oppression in terms of advocating with the government to make changes, not accepting the negative perceptions that were made about them or that they experienced. Or one person in particular, oh my gosh, they would try to go to the university, and the university is like, well, we can't have you, you have a disability. She fought, like she just kept fighting and kept going back, and she would have to do things like say, well, give me 1 week to show that I'm smart. But then she would have to work really hard to show in that 1 week that she was really smart. And so it's just things like that, like you would have to constantly fight against the systems that are in place that don't allow you to have access to those resources. And so she ended up doing really well, and the university president said, well, if you can do it, I guess other people can too. And eventually they allowed other students with disabilities into the university.
That's a really important story to share.
Yeah, that's just one example. Yeah, thank you.
We have 2 questions that are somewhat related. One comes from Sabrina Imam, which reads, what were the ranges of disabilities among your participants?
Ranges of disabilities. So I made a conscious decision not to ask people to identify, because I felt like if they were responding to my call, they had experience that they felt was applicable. Some people, though, did identify. So I can only speak to the people who told me directly what kinds of disabilities they had. So some talked about having physical disabilities. Some talked about having, some said mental health issues. A participant was blind, had visual impairment. So mostly around physical, audio, or sorry, sensory, physical, sensory, and I guess mental health issues, as they termed it.
So the related question comes from Olga Gladkick, which reads, I appreciate having the opportunity to learn more about your work, Tammy. Did you come across examples of the community organizations started by women with disabilities that also come together across disabilities? That seemed to be a challenge at one of the workshops we did here.
Hi, Olga. Yes, that's a good question around whether or not there more than one type of disability was represented in an organization. Let me think. I would say yes. I didn't ask specifically around the kinds of disabilities that participants represented. What they did say, though, was that they wanted to represent the concerns of women with disabilities. And they didn't necessarily say, I just want to represent physical disability because I have a physical disability. What they did focus on was that they wanted to represent the experiences of women. So I didn't ask specifically about the kinds of disabilities that they were addressing. So I guess I could, well, that's a good question, actually. I could follow up with some of that. Yeah, so I guess the overarching theme was that they wanted to deal with the issues that women with disabilities would face.
A kind of follow-up question to that too, that just came to mind, is, so I know in the Charlton book, when he discusses kind of moving from oppression to empowerment, there's also discussion of a perceived hierarchy of disabilities within the disability community. And I'm wondering if you kind of saw any of that in your own work.
I'm consciously aware of it all the time. And many of the participants talked about it. So there's a long-standing understanding, I guess, that the disability movement has been historically represented by physical disability and mostly men representing the movement. So there is definitely a hierarchy of disability. And some of my participants, though, talked about the intersection of having a physical disability and also having an invisible disability at the same time, and how that intersected as well. So anytime that multiple disabilities were talked about among my participants, it was usually having a psychiatric diagnosis along with having a physical disability. Those were the only times that the different kinds of disabilities came out at the same time. Otherwise, it was people talking about their experiences rather than disability specifically, I guess. But these are good questions to think about.
Thank you. Our next one, because we still have a number left here, our next one comes from Mary Eve Ryu Massey. Mary Eve says, thank you for your presentation. I joined by phone first and then joined with the application. It was really interesting. did you address violence at work?
Violence at work. That's a good question too. I like these questions. They get me thinking about what I'm going to do in the future. I didn't specifically address violence at work, except that I did sort of. Participants talked about trying to access the workforce, and so some of them talked about being sexually harassed or those kinds of things. They didn't talk about specifically addressing issues within particular contexts, but addressing issues as a whole within organizations. So I wasn't able to go directly into the workplace scenario to work that through, but that's a good question for future research.
Our next question comes from Sabrina Imam. Do some disabilities make a person more vulnerable?
I don't feel as though I'm qualified based on my dissertation to answer that, except that I will say that when participants talked about young girls with intellectual disabilities, the kinds of violence that they experienced, the powerlessness with which they had those experiences was much more prominent, I guess. So I would say that some disabilities definitely do make people more vulnerable, although we didn't address that directly.
And Sabrina followed up by asking as well, were there some countries that had greater risk for oppression and violence against the women with disabilities?
So when I decided to do my work internationally, to take a global perspective, I did recognize that it would be very hard to do this work across contexts. So the only thing I can say is that I feel like the strength of my research is that there were so many commonalities across countries, that those commonalities are what makes my research strong. In terms of specific contexts where oppression was more obvious, I didn't try to separate that out, I guess, because I wanted to focus on the commonalities. But again, a good question for future research.
Thank you. And Brianne Peters has a follow-up as well. Brianne says, thanks, great answer. Follow up, did you come across any examples of your participants formalizing into an association or group, or did the actions stay informal? In your research and experience, what organizations or associations would you say have had the most impact?
So, thank you, Brianne. I'm trying to think of how many actually started organizations. 3 off the top of my head have formalized organizations in their countries. And they all have impact. I would say any organization that's able to work through all of the perceptions around disability and gender, and then work through the issues around not being represented in existing movements, and then being able to establish themselves in their communities and networking. One organization, for example, started a house a safe house for women who were being abused, and another organization works with governments to change policies and to change things as simple as physical access to the spaces within the government buildings. Another organization works around helping women understand what their rights are in terms of justice and human rights and all of that sort of thing. So I would say that each of these organizations are very strong in being able to represent the needs of the people that they work with. And I also think that the fact that they were even able to establish, one, after being exposed to oppression themselves, and then two, having all of these pushbacks from the community, and then 3, being excluded from all of the movements that are meant to help them. I just think all of the participants that I spoke to were amazing in that way.
Great. And so one kind of broader follow-up question is to ask where you plan to go next with this work.
Well, just based on these questions, I mean, I have all kinds of ideas of the things that I could address. I would like to publish a book based on my dissertation. And I was saying this earlier before the presentation. I have loved doing this research, and I feel very privileged that the participants shared their stories with me. And I made sure I sent all of the stories to the participants, and some of them wrote back and just were very happy with what I had put together for them. One participant said they had never shared their story, and they were so pleased that they were able to share it in this way. Not even their family knew. So I want to get through this process first and defend what I've already written. And I think based on that defense, I definitely want to keep doing this kind of research. And I will. I'm not just saying this, but I really will look at some of the issues that have been brought to my attention today, because I think it's really important. I would like to work with communities, absolutely, yeah.
Thank you. Well, I think likely the other attendees agree that if this presentation is any indication of how the defense will go, I think you're going to do really well. It was really interesting, and we had a lot of interesting questions to follow too. So you may have a number of collaborators in the future coming out of this. And I think we don't have any other questions left. So what I'll say is we can wrap up, but before doing so, Tammy, is there anything else that you wanted to share about the research yourself or otherwise?
Oh, I could talk about my research for hours. I just want to say thank you for the opportunity, and thank you for your kind words. Thank you for your questions and your interest in my research. Please, absolutely do email me. My email is Tammy Bernasky, TammyBernasky @hotmail.com. I would love to hear from you. So if you have any follow-up, or if you want to talk about my research, I love talking about it. And thank you everyone for your interest today. I appreciate it.
Well, a big thank you back to you, Tammy. And just in case, there's just a few other things to note. We do have an ongoing webinar series. We won't have a webinar in August next month, but we have a full docket for the fall term. So please join us for those. If you're interested in future webinars, there are lots of ways to learn about them. You can go to the CRWDP website. There's a news and events section there. There's information on webinars in its own page on the website. And as well, we do send out emails to people who are on the CRWDP student directory. If you're a student, you should join that. And if not, we also have e-alerts for webinar distribution information. Should also say thank you to Kathy Padkapeeva and Sabrina Imam, who make this possible. And just so you know, Tammy, because I'm not sure if you are opening the chat, a number of people had said thank you, great presentation. So I think that's the consensus. And just thank you again for a great presentation, and we'll end off that webinar here. Bye, everyone.
Great, thank you.